Picture the world map in the year 1899. A huge portion of it is colored pink, representing the British Empire. At this moment in history, Queen Victoria reigns over nearly a quarter of the globe. The Royal Navy rules the waves, and the British Army is considered the most disciplined, well-funded fighting force on Earth. They have defeated Napoleon, they have colonized India, they are the undisputed superpower. Now, zoom in on the southern tip of Africa. Here, in the dusty, sun-baked plains known as the Veld, a storm is brewing. The British Empire decides it wants to annex two small independent republics. They expect a quick victory. The British generals sipping tea in their officers' mess genuinely believe the war will be over by Christmas. After all, who are they fighting? Not a professional army, not a European superpower. They are fighting a few thousand farmers with beards and floppy hats. But the empire was wrong, dead wrong. What followed wasn't a quick colonial skirmish. It was a brutal, humiliating slog that would drag the mighty British Empire into the mud and blood of modern warfare. This is the story of the Boer War, the conflict that proved that even the biggest Goliath can bleed if David has the right rifle and enough determination. To understand why this war happened, we have to look at the phenomenon historians call the Scramble for Africa. In the late 19th century, European powers were in a frantic race to carve up the African continent, grabbing territory and resources wherever they could. Down in South Africa, the situation was complicated. The British controlled the Cape Colony on the coast. But inland, there were two independent republics run by the Boers, a Dutch word for farmers. These people, also known as Afrikaners, were descendants of Dutch and German settlers who had arrived centuries earlier. They were deeply religious, fiercely independent, and tough as nails. They had trekked into the wilderness specifically to get away from British rule. For a long time, the British left them alone. The land was dry and seemingly worthless. But then, history played a cruel trick. The Boers were sitting on top of a gold mine. Literally. The discovery of massive gold and diamond deposits in Boer territory changed everything. Suddenly, that dusty land was the most valuable real estate on Earth. British prospectors flooded in, and the British government began plotting to take control. Tensions rose until they reached a breaking point. The British were arrogant. They remembered the Zulu Wars. They thought they knew how to fight in Africa. They lined up their infantry in bright red coats, polished their buttons, and prepared to march in straight lines. They treated war like a gentleman's sport. The Boers, however, were fighting for their homes, their language, and their survival. And they had no intention of fighting fair. War officially broke out in October 1899. The British public expected to read headlines of easy victories in the morning papers. Instead, they woke up to a nightmare. The Boers didn't have a standing army. They didn't wear uniforms. They organized themselves into commandos, militia units made up of neighbors and relatives. Every Boer man was a skilled hunter. They had grown up riding horses and shooting game on the open plains. They knew the terrain, and crucially, they were armed with modern German Mauser rifles that used smokeless powder. This smokeless powder was a game changer. When a British soldier fired his rifle, a puff of black smoke gave away his position. When a Boer fired, he remained invisible. The British commanders marched their troops across the open ground in broad daylight. The Boers simply laid in wait, hidden behind rocks and in trenches, and picked them off from 1,000 yards away. It was a slaughter. In December 1899, the British Army suffered 3 devastating defeats in a single week, a period that became known as Black Week. Thousands of British soldiers were killed or wounded. The glorious Imperial Army was being dismantled by a group of farmers who didn't even have a commander-in-chief in the traditional sense. Panic set in back in London. The Empire was being humiliated on the world stage. It looked like they might actually lose South Africa. To prevent this catastrophe, Britain decided to throw everything they had at the problem. They poured nearly 500,000 soldiers into the country to fight a Boer force that never numbered more than about 80,000 men. Faced with overwhelming numbers, the Boers realized they couldn't win head-on battles anymore. So they changed the game. They dissolved their large units and melted into the landscape. They became ghosts. This was the birth of modern guerrilla warfare. The Boers would strike a British supply train, blow up a railway bridge, and then vanish into the vastness of the veld before the British could react. They lived off the land, supported by their families on the farms. The British generals were furious. They couldn't catch an enemy they couldn't see. So, under the command of Lord Kitchener, the British decided that if they couldn't defeat the army, they would destroy the people who supported them. They initiated a scorched earth policy. This is the darkest chapter of the war. British troops swept across the countryside, burning Boer farms to the ground. They slaughtered livestock, poisoned wells, and destroyed crops. The goal was to starve the guerrillas into submission by destroying their food source. But what do you do with the women and children left homeless by the burning farms? The British solution was to round them up and put them into camps. They called them concentration camps. Now, it is important to note that these were not death camps like the ones in World War II designed for extermination, but the result was horrifyingly similar due to incompetence and neglect. The camps were overcrowded, riddled with disease, and starved of supplies. In these camps, over 26,000 Boer women and children died, mostly from measles and typhoid. It was a humanitarian disaster that shocked the world and left a stain on the British reputation that would last for decades. The scorched earth policy and the suffering of their families finally broke the Boer resistance. In 1902, the Boer leaders sat down to negotiate. They had fought valiantly, holding off the world's greatest superpower for nearly 3 years, but they had nothing left to fight with. Their country was a smoking ruin. The Boers surrendered their independence. The British had won, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. It had cost the empire thousands of lives, millions of pounds, and its moral standing in the world. The war ended the quarrel between the white settlers, leading eventually to the formation of the Union of South Africa. But the bitterness remained. The trauma of the camps and the loss of independence hardened the Afrikaner identity. The Boer War is often forgotten, overshadowed by the world wars that followed. But it was a pivotal moment in history. It showed that the age of easy colonial conquest was over. It introduced the world to trench warfare, guerrilla tactics, and the horrors of concentration camps. In many ways, the Boer War broke the spirit of the British Empire. It exposed the cracks in the armor of the global superpower. And tragically, the uneasy peace that followed laid the groundwork for the oppressive system of apartheid that would dominate South Africa for the rest of the century. The farmers lost the war, but they changed the way the world fought forever. If you found this deep dive into military history fascinating, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the 11th Archive. We explore the events that shaped the modern world, one story at a time.